Today I am going to confess the sin I most want to hide in my life. The sentence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, much like the scent of yeast and burnt sugar that clung to my skin. I didn't say it aloud, of course. I whispered it to the reflection in the stainless steel surface of the industrial oven. It was 400 a.m. The city was asleep, but Eleanor's Bagels was a furnace. My hands were deep in the dough, kneading with a violence that didn't belong in a bakery. 5 years. It had been exactly 5 years since David died. 5 years since I became the tragic, beautiful widow that the neighborhood pitied and adored. The bell above the door chimed. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The heavy, confident footsteps gave him away. "You're here early, Elle." Mark, my late husband's best friend, the executor of his will, the man who paid for my daughter Mia's braces when the shop was in the red. He walked behind the counter, bypassing the employees only sign as if he owned the place. Perhaps in a way he felt he owned me. He stopped right behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He didn't touch me, not yet, but the proximity was a touch in itself. "It's the anniversary, Mark," I said, my voice steady, betraying nothing. I couldn't sleep. Neither could we. The second voice came from the doorway. "Danielle," the quiet one. If Mark was the muscle and the charisma, Daniel was the brain and the conscience that we had all silenced. He leaned against the doorframe, watching us with eyes that looked like shattered glass. "Where is Mia?" Daniel asked. "Upstairs." "Sleeping," I lied. Mia, now 16, was likely awake, listening to the floorboards creak, wondering why her distinct uncles visited so often before sunrise. Mark reached out, his hand sliding over my hip, resting there with a familiarity that would have shocked the customers who saw him as the benevolent protector. His thumb dug into the white apron tied around my waist. "David would be proud of you, you know," Mark whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "Keeping the business alive, raising his daughter." He emphasized his. The word felt like a razor blade. "Stop it," I hissed, pulling away to check the oven timer. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a sickening mixture of guilt and adrenaline. "Why?" Mark smirked, leaning back against the prep table, crossing his arms. "We promised him, Eleanor. On his deathbed. Take care of my girls." That's what he said. Daniel stepped forward, cutting the tension with a sharp laugh. "I don't think this is what he had in mind, Mark." "He knows nothing," Mark shot back, his eyes darkening. "He's dead. We are the ones living with the mess." The atmosphere in the kitchen shifted from mournful to electric. This was the ritual. The anniversary wasn't about remembering David, it was about remembering the lie. The lie that bonded the three of us tighter than any marriage. I wiped the flour from my hands and turned to face them. Two men who had been my husband's brothers in everything but blood. Two men who now looked at me not as a widow, but as an accomplice. "Is the money safe?" I asked, dropping the facade of the grieving baker. Mark's smirk widened. "The account in the Caymans is untouched. Mia's tuition is secured. Your retirement is gold-plated, Eleanor, just like we planned." Daniel looked away, staring at the tray of unbaked bagels. "I saw Mia yesterday," he murmured. "She looks so much like him." "It's haunting." "She looks like Elena," Mark corrected sharply. He walked over to me again, this time boxing me in against the counter. He reached up and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered on my neck, drifting down to my collarbone. "She has your eyes. And your capacity for deception." I didn't flinch. I couldn't. "Get off her, Mark," Daniel warned, though he didn't move to stop him. "She likes it," Mark whispered, his eyes locking onto mine, challenging me to deny it. "Don't you, Elle? You like playing the poor, helpless widow while sitting on a throne of secrets." Suddenly, the wooden staircase in the back creaked. We all froze. Mark pulled his hand back instantly. Daniel straightened up. I spun around toward the dark hallway that led to the apartment above. Mom? Mia stood in the shadows, clutching her phone. The screen's blue light illuminated her face pale, wide-eyed, and terrified. She wasn't wearing her glasses, but she was close enough. How long had she been standing there? Did she hear about the money? Did she see Mark's hand on my neck? Mia, I choked out, my voice trembling for the first time. Honey, go back to bed. We were just Uncle Mark and Uncle Daniel came to pay respects. Mia didn't move. Her gaze darted from me to Mark and finally to Daniel. She didn't look like a child anymore. She looked like a judge. I heard you, she whispered. The air left the room. Mark's hand twitched toward his pocket. Daniel took a step forward, his face pale. What did you hear, Mia? Mark asked, his voice dangerously soft, the tone of a predator masking itself as a friend. Mia looked me dead in the eye. I heard everything. She turned and ran back up the stairs, her footsteps thundering like a countdown. I looked at Mark. The mask of the friendly uncle was gone. In its place was the cold, calculating look of a man who had already buried one friend to protect a secret. Fix this, Elena, Mark said cold, no longer touching me. Or we lose everything. I stared at the dough rising on the counter. It was alive, expanding, unable to be contained. Just like my sin. David died 5 years ago. But looking at the two men standing in my kitchen, I realized the funeral was far from over. The silence in the kitchen wasn't peaceful, it was a verdict. Mark and Daniel had left through the back door, slipping into the pre-dawn darkness like the shadows they were. I was alone again. Well, not entirely. I walked into the dining room. The morning light was just beginning to bleed through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the mahogany table. And there it was, the chair. It stood at the head of the table, an imposing structure of dark oak and worn leather. David's throne. It had been 5 years, yet the indentation of his weight seemed to linger in the cushion, a phantom impression that refused to fade. I ran my hand along the backrest. It was cold. Most widows hate the empty chair because it reminds them of loss. I hated it because it reminded me of the deal. I sat in my usual spot to the right of his. I stared at the empty space. In the quiet, I could almost see him there, David, with his crooked smile and eyes that always seemed to be calculating the cost of everything. Take care of the girls. Mark's voice echoed in my head. I laughed, a dry, brittle sound that cracked the silence. David didn't care about the girls. He cared about the legacy. He cared that his empire of dirty money didn't crumble when his heart stopped beating. And I was the curator of his museum of lies, my reflection caught in the glass of the china cabinet. I looked tired. Not the fatigue of a baker who wakes up at 3 a.m., but the exhaustion of a woman holding up a collapsing ceiling. I placed my hands flat on the table. They were shaking. I'm doing it for her, David, I whispered to the empty chair. I'm lying to her face every single day so she doesn't have to know her father was a monster. The chair didn't answer. It just sat there, judging. The guilt hit me then, a sudden sharp cramp in my stomach. It wasn't the guilt of his death that was an accident, or so we told the police. It was the guilt of my relief. When he died, the shouting stopped. The terror of the police knocking on the door stopped. But in its place, a new terror had grown. A terror named Mark and Daniel. I looked up at the ceiling. The floorboards above were silent now. Mia, my daughter, the only innocent thing left in this house, and now she knew. She had heard us. She had heard about the Cayman accounts, the secrets, the fix. The empty chair seemed to mock me. You failed, it seemed to say. You thought you could play the gangster's wife and the saintly mother at the same time. I stood up, the legs of my chair screeching against the hardwood like a scream. I couldn't look at his seat anymore. It felt like he was sitting there watching me unravel. "I am not you," I hissed at the empty space. "I will not let them destroy her." I grabbed the unfinished bottle of wine Mark had left on the counter and poured it into the sink. The red liquid swirled down the drain like blood. I had to go upstairs. I had to face Mia. I had to look into my daughter's eyes and do the one thing I had become an expert at over the last 5 years. I had to lie. But as I walked past the table, I could have sworn the empty chair turned just an inch to follow me. Saturday mornings were supposed to be lazy. In my house, they were an invasion. At 9 a.m. sharp, the front door opened. They didn't knock anymore. They had keys. Mark walked in first, carrying 2 bags of groceries from Whole Foods, steaks, wine, organic vegetables. The kind of expensive food David used to buy to apologize for staying out all night. Daniel followed, clutching a stack of SAT prep books. "The sink," Mark announced, bypassing a greeting. "You said it was dripping." He didn't wait for a response. He threw his jacket on the sofa and rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, revealing thick forearms covered in dark hair. He marched into the kitchen, crouched under the sink, and began banging his wrench against the pipes. Clang! 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 It sounded like he was forging bars for a cell, not fixing a leak. In the living room, Daniel set up his makeshift classroom on the coffee table. Mia sat opposite him, her posture stiff, her eyes glued to the textbook. She was wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big, pulling the strings tight as if to disappear inside it. "Calculus is all about limits, Mia," Daniel said softly, his voice a low hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You need to know where the boundary lies. And what happens when you cross it?" I stood in the hallway, trapped between the brute force in the kitchen and the intellectual suffocation in the living room. From the outside, through the bay windows, the neighbours likely saw a heartwarming scene. "Look at them, Mrs." Gable from next door would say. "Look how they step up for that poor widow and her fatherless child." They weren't stepping up. They were marking their territory. I walked into the kitchen to start the coffee. Mark slid out from under the cabinet, a smudge of grease on his cheek. He stood up, towering over me in the narrow galley. The smell of sweat and cologne filled the small space. "Fixed," he grunted, washing his hands in the sink he had just conquered. "You need a new washer, but I rigged it. It'll hold." "Thank you, Mark," I said mechanically. "You don't have to do this every week." He turned off the tap slowly and turned to face me. The water dripped from his hands, landing on the floor. He didn't move to wipe it up. "David isn't here to fix the leaks, Elena," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "And you're not built for the dirty work." He took a step closer. I backed up until my spine hit the refrigerator. "We promised him," Mark continued, his eyes scanning my face, looking for cracks. "We handle the house. We handle the money. We handle the girl." "She's smart, Mark." "She doesn't need." "She needs guidance," he interrupted. "Daniel says she's distracted lately. Asking questions." My blood ran cold. "Questions." Mark reached out and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a caress, it was a clamp. He squeezed just hard enough to bruise. "We do this because we love you, Elle," he whispered, a twisted parody of affection. "Look at this house. It would fall apart without us." He leaned in, his breath smelling of mint and rot. "You're not alone," he said. The phrase was meant to be comforting, a lifeline. But coming from him, in the house my dead husband paid for with blood money, it sounded like a life sentence. "You're not alone," he repeated, releasing his grip and patting my cheek. "Remember that. Especially when you feel like doing something stupid." He walked past me, grabbing a bagel from the counter, and headed into the living room to check on Daniel's progress with my daughter. I stood in the kitchen, listening to Daniel's soft voice explaining derivatives to Mia, while Mark laughed at something on the TV. They had seamlessly inserted themselves into the vacuum David left behind. I wasn't alone. I was surrounded. The school bus was enormous, a yellow whale gulping down a stream of teenagers. Mia didn't look back. She gave a perfunctory squeeze to my hand, her eyes flat and distant, a carryover from the icy silence she'd maintained since her accidental eavesdropping. "Have fun, honey," I forced out, my voice bright and false. "Don't forget to call." Mia nodded curtly and climbed the steps. She found a window seat, pulled down the shade, and was gone. I stood on the curb until the bus was a distant speck, and then longer still. I stood until the rumble of the engine faded entirely, leaving behind the sterile, unnerving silence of a Tuesday morning on a cul-de-sac. The silence was the hook. It was the deepest, most illicit pleasure I had experienced in 5 years. I turned and walked back into the house. The front door clicked shut. I didn't just hear the lock, I heard the sound of a cage opening. The house was enormous suddenly. It felt like a cathedral, empty, echoing, and consecrated to a lie. The air, usually thick with the low-level tension of motherhood, was clean and cool. I walked directly to the dining room. David's empty chair still sat at the head of the table, but now, without Mia's watchful, suspicious presence nearby, it didn't feel like a judge. It felt like an invitation to be reckless. I stripped off my apron and my sensible cardigan. For the next 72 hours, I wasn't Elena, the grieving mother who smells like yeast and pity. I was just Elena. The relief was visceral, a wave of liquid heat starting in my chest and radiating outward. I didn't have to monitor my expressions. I didn't have to filter my calls. I didn't have to lie with my eyes. Freedom. I walked through the house touching things. Daniel's calculus textbook was still on the living room sofa, the pages dog-eared. I picked it up. A hollow pit formed in my stomach, the counterweight to the sudden surge of freedom. The house was empty, yes, but the emptiness wasn't pure solitude. It was David's emptiness, an absence that had been carefully managed by Mark and Daniel to ensure I never truly escaped. Mia was my shield, my distraction, my anchor to morality. With her gone, the anchor was up. I was adrift. The guilt of that realization that my daughter's absence felt like a vacation was overwhelming. I was cleaning Daniel's pencil marks off the sofa cushion when my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up, illuminating the deep pit of the sink Mark had fixed. It wasn't a call from the camp. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message contained only 3 words. "The coast is clear." My heart slammed against my ribs, cancelling out the momentary peace. My freedom wasn't a gift, it was a planned absence. Mia's 3-day camp hadn't just freed me from the responsibility of motherhood, it had cleared the stage for the true players. I knew immediately what it meant. Mark and Daniel weren't just the helpers. They were the keepers of the prison, and now the warden was coming for a visit. I walked to the front window and pulled back the blind. The street was empty. Too empty. My 3 days of freedom had just been redefined as 3 days of opportunity. For them, and perhaps for me to make a terrible final mistake. I looked down at the phone, then back at the empty house, my lungs tightening. I wasn't alone. I was available. The hours between the cryptic text and the ring of the bell had been a slow, agonizing slide into paranoia. I hadn't turned on the television. I hadn't opened a book. I had simply paced the house, listening to the expensive, suffocating silence Mia's departure had gifted me. I was ready for him, but readiness did little to stop the jolt that shot through my spine when the doorbell finally screamed at 8:03 p.m. I smoothed down the fabric of my silk shirt, not a shirt for kneading dough, but a shirt for waiting, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, Mark filled the frame. He was wearing an expensive, casual leather jacket and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. In his right hand, he held a bottle of deep Bordeaux. I took a deep breath. Do not let him in. I could pretend I was asleep. But Mark already knew I was awake. He was testing the boundary. I unlatched the lock. The click was loud in the empty house. He stepped back slightly as I opened the door, just enough to be polite, but not enough to be denied. The air immediately changed from the stale quiet of my waiting to the brisk scent of autumn night and Mark's rich cologne. "Elena," he said, his voice low, a velvet rasp. He held up the wine. "Thought you might need something better than that instant muck you drink." "Mark, what are you doing here?" My voice was sharp, a reflex. He chuckled, a short dismissive sound. "Can't a guy visit his best friend's widow?" He moved, and I instinctively moved backward, creating space that he instantly reclaimed. He stepped across the threshold without an invitation, crossing the line from the world outside into my sanctuary of lies. "I just wanted to see you," he said, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. He leaned in close to kiss my cheek. His lips brushed my skin, but his eyes were on my mouth. The kiss was far too intimate for a friend, far too brief for a lover. "I got your text," I managed, my pulse beating a frantic rhythm against my temples. "The one about the coast." Mark smirked, placing the wine on the nearest table. It was a good vintage, heavy and dark. "Oh, that, just checking in. Wouldn't want you to get too lonely in this big, quiet house." His eyes drifted upward toward the ceiling, where Mia's room lay silent. He was confirming that the silence was real, that the witness was gone. "Where's Daniel?" I asked, forcing myself to stand still, refusing to let him see the tremor in my hands. "Daniel," Mark scoffed, pouring himself into my favorite armchair, David's armchair. "Daniel is boring. He's home, probably grading papers. He worries too much about ethics." He looked at me then, his gaze piercing. "We don't worry about ethics, do we, Elle? We worry about survival." He reached over and ran his finger along the edge of the mahogany table, stopping where David's wedding ring used to scratch the finish. "It's empty, isn't it?" he whispered. "This house. Without the kid, without David, it's just the two of us. And the furniture that remembers." He unzipped his jacket, the sound like ripping silk. His confidence was a physical thing, filling the vacuum left by David and Mia. "I came here," Mark continued, leaning forward, his eyes never leaving mine, "because I needed to know if you remembered what we risked, what we gained." He reached for my hand, his palm rough and hot. His thumb brushed over the inside of my wrist, testing my surrender. "You're beautiful when you're cornered, Elena." David never appreciated that. He brought my hand to his lips and kissed the back of it, a feudal gesture of ownership. "Let's open this wine," he murmured, the words promising secrets and destruction. "And let's talk about 3 days of silence." He wasn't here to reminisce. He was here to claim his prize, and the silence of the empty house was the loudest invitation of all. The bottle of Bordeaux stood uncorked on the table, a dark, silent witness. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and new danger. Mark didn't pour the wine. He didn't have to. The alcohol was already running through the conversation, blurring the lines between grief and desire, friendship and betrayal. I pulled my hand away from his, the skin prickling where his thumb had rested. "You shouldn't be here, Mark. You know that." He ignored the protest, his gaze locked on mine, intense and unapologetic. He was a man who took what he wanted, and tonight he was auditing his assets. "Do I?" Mark leaned back in David's chair, crossing his arms. The territorial confidence was breathtaking. "For 5 years I've been the dutiful friend. I managed the books, paid the taxes, kept the creditors off your back. I raised your daughter at least. I was the stable male presence she needed." His voice was a low, steady current pulling me under. "You think that was about David? You think I wasted my Saturday mornings on calculus just to honor a dead man? I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It was about the secret. It was about protecting what David left behind. Mark laughed, the sound loud and cynical in the empty room. He stood up slowly, deliberately, and closed the distance between us. He didn't rush. He moved like a predator certain of its prey. He stopped inches from me. I could feel the heat radiating off him. The secret is the glue, Eleanor. I won't deny that. But the truth is something else. He reached out, cupping my jaw with his hand, forcing me to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, burning with an emotion that was less love and more fixation. I've been in love with you for 10 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. They weren't soft or romantic. They were a violent declaration of ownership, a confession that indicted all three of us. My breath hitched. That's not fair. David was your friend. David was a liar and a cheat who was too blind to see the fire he was sitting on, Mark hissed, his voice tightening. I saw it, though. I saw you, the day you walked into the firm's Christmas party, wearing that red dress. You looked like you were daring the world to burn you. I've been waiting for my chance to light the match ever since. He paused, letting the magnitude of the timeline sink in 10 years. 5 years before the death, 5 years after, even before I realized it shouldn't feel that way. The raw, predatory honesty of it shattered my defenses. For 5 years, I had held on to guilt, loneliness, and the sterile safety of widowhood. But beneath the guilt, there was a craving for the danger Mark embodied. He wasn't David. David was weakness wrapped in bluster. Mark was pure, focused power. My shaky hand lifted, not to push him away, but to rest on his chest. I could feel his heart hammering beneath the leather jacket. And that night, I whispered, my voice barely audible. When it happened, was that part of this 10 years? Mark didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, the only sign of the dark history hanging between us. It was a release, Elle, for both of us. The only way we could ever stop pretending. He lowered his head. I didn't pull away. I didn't even consider it. The dam of loneliness and suppressed desire burst. His kiss was everything the secret was desperate, consuming, and laced with the taste of guilt. It wasn't tender. It was a claiming, a confirmation that the helpers were actually the inheritors. I gripped the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer, plunging myself into the dangerous heat that had been promised since the moment David's chair became empty. The silence of the house became our accomplice, wrapping around us like a shroud. The wine remained untouched. We had a different kind of poison. His hands slid down my back, pulling me tight against him. I felt the last shreds of my widow persona, the guilt, the fear, the propriety shatter and fall away. All that was left was the truth of the affair that had begun in the shadows and was now erupting in the light of the empty home. We stumbled away from the door, the urgency erasing all caution. My hands were already tearing at his shirt, desperate to expose the man who had loved me in the dark for so long. The kiss turned into a consuming embrace, fueled by a decade of suppressed longing and the dark, shared secret of a death we had never truly mourned. The house wasn't empty anymore. It was finally, explicitly, theirs. I woke to the brutal clarity of the morning light. It was cold and unforgiving, slicing through the blinds and illuminating the scattered evidence of the night before: the discarded silk shirt, Mark's leather jacket. Draped over David's chair, the uncorked bottle of Bordeaux still untouched on the counter. I was alone in the bed. The spot where Mark had slept was already cool, confirming my worst fear: the night had been temporary, not transformative. I sat up, clutching the sheet to my chest, every muscle aching from the violent release of a decade's tension. I found Mark in the kitchen. He was impeccably dressed suit trousers, crisp white shirt, already the businessman, the pillar of the community. He was retrieving his phone and car keys from the counter, every movement efficient and detached. He didn't turn when he heard me enter the doorway. He didn't offer a fond glance or a knowing smile. As he reached for his jacket, he glanced over his shoulder. His expression was cool, assessing, devoid of the predatory heat of the previous night. "Hey, Elna," he said. The address was a punch to the gut. It was casual, flat, exactly the same tone he used when discussing the quarterly earnings of David's shell company. There was no darling, no sweetheart, no reference to the confessions and contortions we had shared just hours before. The intimate L had been revoked. "You're leaving already?" I asked, the question sounding needy and pathetic even to my own ears. "Early meeting," he replied, slipping into his jacket. He zipped it up, sealing himself off from the mess we'd made. Things don't run themselves, you know, especially David's things. He walked toward the door, not looking back. He had satisfied the terms of the temporary contract and was now moving on to the next item on his agenda. The intense declaration of 10 years of love was forgotten, or perhaps it had served its sole purpose to get him what he came for. "Mark," I stopped him, my voice brittle. "Last night." "What was that?" He paused with his hand on the doorknob. He finally turned, offering a tight, patronizing smile. "That was long overdue, Eleanor. And enjoyable. It proves we still work well together, doesn't it?" He tapped the wine bottle with his finger. "But the passion is just seasoning. The meat of the deal is still the arrangement. You, the house, the bakery, the kid. Me and Daniel keeping the entire damn structure from collapsing." He stepped outside, pausing only to deliver the final blow. "Mia is back in 3 days. Don't do anything to jeopardize the schedule." Then he was gone. The door closed with a soft final click. The silence that rushed back into the house was no longer a freedom, it was a mocking, crushing emptiness. I walked to David's armchair where Mark had sat, where he had confessed his illicit decade of longing. I sank down into the cushion, pulling his discarded leather jacket onto my lap. It smelled of him cologne, sweat, and something metallic, like banked ambition. The hollowness was absolute. I hadn't found a lover, I had merely confirmed a co-conspirator. I had traded the guilt of being David's indifferent widow for the far heavier guilt of being Mark's cheap conquest. My eyes fell on Mia's jacket, which I had forgotten to put away before Mark arrived, still hanging on the hook by the coat closet. I didn't just feel empty, I felt profoundly dirty. The cost of my 3 days of freedom was now stamped on my soul. I was still alone, but now I was the active betrayer, the willing participant in the system designed to control me. Mark didn't call. The first day after he left, I told myself he was respecting the boundary, keeping up appearances. The second day, I told myself he was busy managing the real danger, the money, the business, the network of lies we all depended on. By the third day, the silence was a physical weight, heavier than the guilt, sharper than the shame. It wasn't indifference, it was control. He had established his dominance, claimed his prize, and then retreated, leaving me in the wreckage of my own making. He had proven that he could have me whenever he chose, and his absence was merely a reminder of my waiting period. I cleaned the house obsessively. I scrubbed the flour from the kitchen floor, wiped the fingerprints off the glass table, and bleached the sheets he had lain in. But no amount of disinfectant could touch the rot spreading inside me. I was waiting for the ring of the phone, waiting for the 3 casual, predatory words that signaled my next opportunity to betray David. But there was nothing. Just the deafening hum of the refrigerator and the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Mia was due back tomorrow, and I needed Mark to call first. I needed him to validate the night so I could figure out the new terms of the lie I had to sell to my daughter. At 7:45 p.m., Just as the last of the autumn light faded, the sound came. It wasn't the aggressive jolt of the doorbell Mark favoured. It was a hesitant, quiet knock, 2 sharp raps, polite and restrained. It was Daniel. I opened the door to find him standing on the porch. He was wearing his usual tailored coat, but he looked entirely undone. His face, usually so composed and analytical, was a battlefield of emotions. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept for a week, and his eyes, those keen, shattered glass eyes, were wide with a complicated mix of suspicion, sadness, and something dangerously close to pity. "Daniel," I said, my voice thin, "I didn't expect you." "I know," he replied, his voice flat. He wasn't carrying books or groceries. He was carrying a burden. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, and he walked past me, radiating the chill of the outside air. He didn't sit in David's chair. He stood in the center of the living room, hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking less like a friendly tutor and more like a prosecutor surveying a crime scene. "Where's Mark?" he asked, the question cutting through the silence like a wire. I feigned ignorance, the reflex honed over 5 years, kicking in instantly. "Mark, I don't know. Did he not tell you where he was going?" Daniel didn't answer with words. He answered with a look, a long, agonizing assessment that stripped away my false surprise, the clean clothes, and the pretense of being a normal widow. He knew Mark hadn't just disappeared. He knew Mark had been here, and his subsequent silence was a deliberate move. "He missed 2 meetings," Daniel continued, his voice low and serious. "The kind of meetings you don't miss, Elena. The kind that keep the lid on things." He finally took his hands out of his pockets. They were trembling slightly. "Mark told me once that the key to control is always making the other person wait," Daniel confessed, his eyes drifting to the empty space above the sofa, where Mark's jacket had been draped the night before. "He said if you leave them alone with their guilt long enough, they'll confess to anything." I felt the blood drain from my face. Daniel wasn't here to ask about Mark. He was here because Mark had sent him. "I haven't talked to him," I lied, the words tasting like ashes. Daniel sighed, a deep, weary sound. He walked to the window, his back to me, and looked out at the dark street. "Mia comes back tomorrow," he said, changing the subject, but not the tone. "Mark told me to come by to check on you, to make sure you're ready for her." He paused, then added, his voice barely a whisper, "And to make sure you didn't do anything else stupid while you were alone." He turned around, and the pity in his eyes was replaced by a cold, devastating certainty. He knew about the affair, or at least he strongly suspected, and Mark was using his guilt to control both of us. "You're not built for the chaos, Elena," Daniel said, stepping closer. "Mark is. I'm just here to clean up the paperwork." The silence wasn't Mark's punishment, it was the mechanism of his control. And Daniel, the quiet, ethical one, was the reluctant hand delivering the final instruction. Daniel's words, "Mark told me to come by, to check on you," had already shattered my composure. But his eyes, filled with accusation and that painful, complicated pity, were preparing the ground for total destruction. He didn't wait for me to deny the affair. He didn't need to. He knew that the only reason Mark would go silent for 3 days was to isolate me, and the only reason Mark would send Daniel to deliver a veiled threat was to cement his dominance over both of us. "Mark said I was here to make sure you didn't do anything stupid," Daniel repeated, his voice barely a murmur, his back still partially turned to the window. "But I'm here because I'm worried about the whole damn structure, Eleanor. Not just the secret, but you." I felt bile rise in my throat. "You have no right to judge me. You have no idea what it's like to live in this house, to carry that secret alone." Daniel spun around, his calmness finally snapping. His eyes were blazing. "I know what happened." His voice was harsh, devoid of the gentle patience he usually reserved for Mia's calculus lessons. He took a decisive step forward, forcing me to retreat against the sofa. I know what happened because Mark bragged about it. The air left my lungs. The casual cruelty of the revelation was worse than a physical blow. Mark hadn't just used me, he had used the conquest as currency, a boast shared with his silent partner. The fierce, desperate embrace of the night before was reduced to a locker room story, a testament to Mark's control over the widow and the house. "He told you," I whispered, the words trembling. "He didn't tell me the logistics, no, but he told me that his insurance policy was secured," Daniel said, his lip curling with disgust. "He came to my office yesterday, smelling of stale perfume and cheap victory. He said, Elle's been properly reminded of her allegiance. He treats you like property, Elena. Like a deed he finally got notarized. The realization was crippling. I hadn't been a willing participant in an affair, I had been a tool of Mark's power play. The shame was suffocating. I had traded the noble pain of grief for the squalid shame of being manipulated." Daniel watched me crumble, his expression softening slightly. He had delivered the truth, but the delivery had clearly cost him. He moved away from me, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, older than his 45 years. He walked over to David's empty chair, but instead of sitting in it, he rested his hand gently on the backrest, a silent acknowledgement of the void. "But I need you to know something," he said, his voice dropping to a fragile whisper that felt more intimate than Mark's loudest declaration. I looked up, bracing myself for another condemnation, another threat. Daniel's conflicted gaze met mine. His eyes were flooded with an emotion that was raw and utterly unguarded, a kind of suffering I hadn't seen in him since the day David died. "I loved you first." The 3 words were quiet, but they detonated in the empty room. They changed the entire landscape of the past decade. First. Not better, not more purely, but first. Before the red dress, before the firm party, before David had dragged them all into the shadow economy. "Before Mark," Daniel clarified, his voice thick with a decade of suppressed regret. "The summer you and David met. I saw you first. I wanted to tell you, but Mark was always louder, faster. And I was David's friend. He turned away, unable to sustain the vulnerability. I stayed silent because I was loyal to David. I stayed loyal even after he died, managing his wreckage, because I thought it was the only way I could stay close to you." The air was electric. I wasn't trapped in a triangle anymore. I was at the center of a decade-long silent siege. Mark had claimed my body to assert his power. Daniel had claimed my truth to assert his heart. Both men had used David's death as an opportunity, but their motivations were terrifyingly different. "You knew Mark and I couldn't finish the sentence. I knew Mark wanted you," Daniel corrected, his hand gripping the back of David's chair until his knuckles were white. "And I knew you were too lonely and too guilty to resist him. I hoped my presence, the lessons, the groceries would be enough to hold the line." He looked back at me, his eyes pleading. "Mark sees you as a victory. I see you as a victim. And I came here tonight to warn you he's escalating. He thinks the silence, followed by this, will break you. And when you break, you'll do whatever he says." Daniel took a step toward the door, leaving me reeling in the aftermath of 2 devastating confessions. He stopped short of the exit. "Mia is coming home tomorrow," he said, the protective tutor resurfacing briefly. "You have to be ready. And you need to stop letting him treat you like a prize." He didn't say goodbye. He simply vanished into the night, leaving me with the knowledge that the man I had slept with had bragged about it, and the man who was silently saving me had loved me first. I was alone again, but now I knew I was being watched by 2 men, not 1. And one of them, the quieter one, had just given me a very dangerous weapon, his secret. Daniel's confession, the quiet truth that he had loved me first. And the shattering revelation that Mark had bragged about our night did what 5 years of solitary guilt could not. It broke me. I didn't move from the living room for hours after Daniel left. I remained slumped on the sofa, enveloped in a paralyzing chill despite the warmth of the evening. The emptiness of the house was now compounded by the agonizing fullness of the truth. I had always imagined my survival as a complex web of necessary lies spun to protect Mia. Now I saw the true structure. I wasn't the spider, I was the fly, caught in a carefully constructed net woven by David's 2 best friends. The realization hit with brutal clarity. Every act of kindness had been a reconnaissance mission. The repairs Mark did every Saturday. Not generosity, but a territorial assertion, a way to place his hand on the structure of my life, claiming the role of the man of the house. The groceries. A meticulous record of my consumption, ensuring I remained dependent, proving he was the provider David could no longer be. Daniel's tutoring Mia, not pedagogical help, but constant surveillance. A clean intellectual access point to my daughter, the leverage I valued most. Mark hadn't simply been waiting for David to die. He had been actively, patiently cultivating the vacuum that would allow him to step in. His 10 years of love were 10 years of strategic patience. And my night with him. It wasn't a desperate act of passion, it was the payment of a long-held debt. I stood up, stumbling through the dark kitchen. The bagel shop, my supposed fortress of normalcy, now felt like a front for their operation. The image of Mark, post-coital, zipping up his expensive jacket and giving me a casual businesslike, "Hey, Elena," flashed behind my eyes. I hadn't been seduced, I had been processed. The emptiness of the house became a terror. Mia was returning tomorrow, and I had destroyed the moral high ground I needed to face her. I had nothing left to offer her but my own compromised existence. The sleepless watch. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, the sheets tangled and cold, my mind spinning on a torturous, endless loop. I didn't just worry about Mark's next move. I began to obsess over Daniel's confession, "I loved you first." Was that a warning, a desperate plea for alliance, or just another, more delicate layer of control? Mark used aggression, Daniel used vulnerability. They were 2 sides of the same coin, each working to keep me off balance and indebted. I kept looking at my phone, not waiting for Mark's call, but dreading it. I dreaded the sound of the text that would inevitably come a cold, short instruction on how to behave when Mia returned. The thought of facing Mia, the one pure, innocent thing I had sworn to protect, was agony. How could I look at her when I had allowed the very men who covered up her father's shadowy dealings to breach the last physical and emotional boundary I possessed? I walked into Mia's empty room. Her clothes were still neatly folded in the dresser. Her bed was made. The silence here was different. It was a monument to the lie I maintained. I pressed my face into her pillow, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of her shampoo. They did this to me, and I let them. The truth was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The help, the friendship, the shared sorrow, it was all a brilliant, decade-long psychological manipulation. I hadn't been saved by David's friends, I had been inherited by his conspirators. I finally collapsed onto the floor, the cold wood pressing against my cheek. I wasn't weeping. I was simply broken, emptied of all fight, all deception. The darkest realization was the most humiliating I knew. The men who had been helping me were dangerous. I knew they were connected to David's illicit money, but it took the utter contempt of Mark's morning after dismissal, relayed through Daniel's heartbroken confession, to finally shatter my delusion of control. I was not the grieving widow protecting her cub. I was the fool who had mistaken her jailers for her guardians. And now the true isolation had begun. Tomorrow Mia would return, and I would be forced to smile and pretend the house hadn't just hosted a declaration of war. The morning Mia returned, I was a perfectly assembled lie. I had bleached the guilt from my skin, scrubbed the fear from my eyes, and donned the crisp armor of the dependable mother. Mia, weary from the camp bus, was quiet, but she seemed to accept the facade. My immediate survival depended on holding that smile. Once Mia was safely back in her room, the adrenaline wore off, and the crushing realization from Chapter 10 solidified into resolve. I was betrayed. I was used, but I was not powerless. I spent the afternoon cleaning my internal house. The blackout. The first step was severance. Mark and Daniel's control relied on their constant access, the seamless integration into my life. I needed to cut the lines, creating a silence that was deliberate, not forced. I blocked Mark's number. I blocked the burner number he had used for the cryptic "Coast is clear" text. His access to me was physical, and I would make that access difficult. Daniel was trickier. He was interwoven with Mia's routine. I started small. I texted him, "Polite and professional, Mia's schedule is full for the next few weeks. We'll handle the tutoring sessions internally. Thank you for your help." I didn't engage in his love confession or Mark's betrayal. I simply dismissed the helper. The immediate consequence was Mark's fury. My phone, despite the blocks, was bombarded with frantic emails from his business account marked urgent, family matter. "I need to talk to you, Elena. Now." This isn't smart. I deleted them without reading. The eclipse. The true nature of my revenge, however, wasn't noise, it was silence. I had their secrets, the shared criminal act of David's death, the initial bond, Mark's predatory conquest, the betrayal, and Daniel's decade-long silent love, the vulnerability. My initial frantic thought had been to detonate the entire thing, call their wives, tell them about the money, about the affair, expose the rot to the light. But in the cold, clear aftermath of my collapse, I realized destruction would only lead to collateral damage and jail time. Exposure would destroy Mia's security and shatter the delicate structure of the life David's death had created. My revenge had to be surgical, quiet, and eternal. I sat at the dining room table, staring at David's empty chair, a strange, grim clarity washing over me. I won't destroy their marriages. Mark and Daniel had two things to lose that were far more valuable than their marriages, their control, and their conscience. I picked up the untouched bottle of Bordeaux Mark had brought. I walked to the kitchen sink and poured the expensive wine down the drain. The sight of the deep red liquid swirling down the chrome was deeply satisfying. I wasn't going to tell. I wasn't going to confess. I was going to let them live with the knowledge of what they had done, what they had become, and what I knew. But they will destroy themselves with guilt. Mark, the predator, would be consumed by the fear that I knew his secret, the real secret. The vulnerability of his affection for me, not just the affair he bragged about. He would watch the silence, terrified that the woman he thought he controlled was now holding the detonation cord. His confidence would rot from the inside out. Daniel, the silent loyalist, was already suffering. The memory of his long-held secret love, coupled with the knowledge that he had betrayed it by relaying Mark's contempt, would be a constant, searing pain. He would wonder every day if my silence meant I was judging him as a lover or pitying him as a pawn. I was going to use their own emotions as my weapon. My silence was the ultimate threat. It signaled that I was no longer a player in their game, but the referee holding the final score. I was not going to expose them to the outside world. I was going to expose them to themselves. I would keep Mia safe. I would run the bakery. And every time Mark saw me from across the street, every time Daniel saw my number on his caller ID, they would see the woman they betrayed and the secret they thought they could manage. The revenge was complete. I had achieved revenge eclipse, plunging their carefully constructed lives into the darkness of their own guilt, using the very thing they valued most, my silence as the instrument of their slow, agonizing destruction. The phone rang. It was Daniel. I watched it vibrate across the counter. I let it ring. The new game had begun. The stillness I had imposed on Mark and Daniel, the silence of my refusal to engage, was not an act of surrender. It was the preparation for war. With the immediate adrenaline of the affair gone, I felt a terrifying clarity. The only way to survive David's legacy was to completely dismantle my dependence on his executors. I looked at my life and saw only anchors tethering me to their control. My first task was to cut the ropes. The surgical separation. I started with the internal damage. I found a psychologist miles from the bakery, ensuring zero overlap with the lives of Mark, Daniel, or Mia's school network. I called the sessions grief counselling, a bitter irony I kept to myself. I spoke not about the crime, but about the suffocating roles I was forced to play: the grieving widow, the debt-ridden business owner, the passive object of male attention. The therapy was a psychological excision. I learned to look at Mark's texts and Daniel's troubled eyes not as personal dramas, but as professional threats. They had stripped me of my autonomy. I was taking it back, piece by piece. Simultaneously, I initiated a physical transformation. I joined a rigorous early morning kickboxing class. The repetitive violence of striking a bag became a cathartic release, each heavy impact a blow against the years of suppressed rage. The softness of the widow melted away, replaced by the defined, unforgiving muscle of a woman who was done being handled. My body was no longer a commodity for their desire or pity. It was the sharp, protective housing of my mind. Financial defiance. The bagel shop Eleanor's had to stop being David's heirloom and become my empire. I used the clean funds Mark had meticulously managed for Mia's future and funneled them into an aggressive expansion. I bought the lease for the laundromat next door, knocking out the connecting wall to double the shop's size. I hired a new financial manager and explicitly instructed her no communications with any outside contacts named Mark or Daniel. If they called about consulting or checking in on David's investment, she was to refer them to my new corporate lawyer. I wasn't just fixing the pipes anymore, I was building a fortress with its own security protocols. I cut off the information supply, making them blind to my moves. The new man as a weapon. The true signal of my independence was not the brick and mortar, but the face I chose to put next to mine. Liam, the commercial architect, was kind, steady, and utterly unconnected to the grimy past. He was the antithesis of everything David, Mark, and Daniel represented. When he talked, it was about zoning permits and sustainable materials, not offshore accounts and suppressed violence. He became a frequent presence at the shop, poring over blueprints with me after hours. It was professional, but the easy camaraderie we shared, the sheer normalcy of it, was deliberately visible. The day Mark finally tried to breach my defenses, cruising slowly past the shop after 3 days of blocked calls, he saw us. Liam was standing close, laughing at something I'd said, his hand resting lightly on the back of my neck as he pointed to a diagram. Mark's black sedan slammed on the brakes 50 feet past the window. I didn't flinch. I let him watch. The furious, possessive energy that radiated off him was palpable, but Mark was trapped. He couldn't storm in and demand an explanation. He couldn't claim the widow who was laughing with another man because he had forfeited his right to my personal life. When he treated me like a secret transaction, I saw the chilling shift in his eyes, the lust and control curdled into naked fear. I was no longer his secret. I was no longer David's wife. I was simply Eleanor, an independent person, and that independence was the most potent threat of all. I was not dependent on their help, their money, or their dangerous, complicated love. I was a sovereign nation, and they were foreign threats. A year. 1 year has passed since I poured Mark's expensive wine down the drain. 1 year since I cut the toxic umbilical cord of David's death, and decided that my life and Mia's would not be managed by the guilt of 2 broken men. The expansion of Eleanor's Bagels is a triumph. We opened the new section 6 months ago. The line is out the door every morning. Liam is still here, not as a lover, but as a genuine partner in the business. He knows nothing of the dark currency that funded the foundation, and I keep it that way. Mark and Daniel are ghosts. They call the new corporate line they drive past the shop. They watch me, sometimes individually, sometimes together. They see the woman they tried to control, thriving, laughing, entirely untouchable. They know I hold the final card, and my silence is a continuous, agonizing punishment. Their marriages are intact, their careers are steady, but they are living in a permanent, self-inflicted hell. I am free, or so I tell myself. I sit here now, alone in my apartment above the shop, the quiet no longer oppressive, but reflective. Mia is asleep upstairs, preparing for her first year of university. Her future, funded by criminal money and secured by my unwavering commitment to the lie, is bright. I stare directly into the lens of the camera, the invisible eye of the world, the witness who knows everything. A year has passed, but I still have to ask. My voice is steady, stripped of the tremor of fear, but edged with the cold wisdom of a survivor. I have my life. I have my daughter's security. I have my peace. I gained it all by refusing to speak, by letting the truth die with David. And the men who hurt me, they are destroying themselves far more effectively than any prison sentence ever could. I look away, considering the cost, the endless cycle of justifications. But every night when I am alone, David's empty chair accuses me. It doesn't accuse me of his death, it accuses me of choosing convenience over morality. It accuses me of becoming just as ruthless as the men I despise. I turn back to the camera, the question hanging heavy between us. If you were me, would you tell the truth, or would you just keep living? I place my hands flat on the table, the new strength in my arms a testament to the brutal discipline of the last year. I know the arguments on both sides. Sometimes silence is grace. Grace for Mia. Grace for the years I spent believing in something good. But sometimes silence is cowardice. Cowardice in the face of true justice. The truth is, I don't know the answer. I have chosen survival, and survival means keeping the eclipse going. I have chosen not to destroy the world, but to watch it suffer. The question remains, when does the choice to protect your life stop being strength and start being the ultimate sin? I don't know, and maybe I never will. My lips curve into a faint, unreadable smile. The camera keeps rolling, and so we bring the Empty Chair series to its chilling conclusion. Eleanor's journey from grieving widow to calculating survivor has been a brutal lesson in the cost of autonomy. She claimed her independence, but the truth about David's death, the betrayal of Mark, and the silent love of Daniel still binds her. We leave her here, successful, untouchable, and forever haunted by the ultimate, unresolved question. When does silence stop being self-preservation and start becoming the deepest form of sin? The moral eclipse is complete, and the final verdict remains yours to decide. If Eleanor's relentless fight for survival and the dark complexity of her choice captivated you, then please help us bring more intense psychological dramas to life. Don't keep us in the dark. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story, where we explore the terrifying cost of getting exactly what you wished for. Until then, remember, every quiet house holds a dangerous secret.